Okay, hello. Welcome to my Visualizing Peace literature review presentation. Here we go. So what comes to mind when you hear the term peace building? I guarantee you that for the majority of people, one of the first things that springs into their head is an image similar to the one you see on the screen now, the armed UN peacekeeper on an overseas mission. And admittedly, if you'd asked younger Matthias what peace and peace building meant to him, I can guarantee you it also would have been something very similar. Peace as being not only fundamentally rooted in security, so peace as being the absence of conflict and the need to establish security as a precondition for reconciliation or reconstruction, but also this notion of peace as being something that is rooted fundamentally in international or supranational organizations like the United Nations or the World Bank. And interestingly enough, that's also the conception of peace that is shared in many IR scholars. So before I delve into the actual specific visualization of peace in IR, I think it's very important to just do a quick run through of some dominant themes in IR literature. So peace in international relations is rooted largely in two key IR theories. These are known as the orthodox theories of IR, and they are realism and liberalism. So realism essentially refers to the notion that states are inherently self-interested and that they exist in a system of anarchy, which means that no overarching international government exists. As a result, states are forced into a system of self-help where they're forced to rely on themselves to meet their security needs. And the international system is consequently inherently conflictual. And thus the visualization of peace that emerges is peace as being just the absence of conflict or those limited windows in between interstate conflicts. In contrast, liberalism, the other orthodox theory of IR, emphasizes the potential for cooperation, but is still very institutionally centered. So this cooperation requires the participation and the leadership of elite institutions of international and national governance. And so it's, in a sense, an institutionally driven negative peace. And so the visualization of peace then that emerges in international relations as a whole is going to draw features from both of these schools of thought. And so the peace in IR is known as the liberal peace. So let's go over a few key features of that. So the liberal peace is first and foremost negative peace centered. So peace as being the absence of conflict that can be, in the form of physical violence or psychological violence, or the threat of violence in general. Peace as being top down in nature. So it's going to be led. It's going to be primarily directed and led at the highest echelons of national and international government by those elite figures. Peace is being institutionally driven. So the most important peace building actors, according to the notion of liberal peace, are both industrialized democracies, generally in the West, as well as international organizations like the United Nations and the World Bank. And because of that, and so because of the driving actors behind the liberal peace, it's oftentimes also going to be tied to Western systems of liberal democracy. So liberal peace is going to be very closely connected to the establishment of, for instance, democratically elected governments, a free market economy based on competition and deregulation, and similar aspects that we generally see in industrialized democracies in the global North. And also, just given the sheer dominance of liberalism and realism, which are the liberal peace's two underlying theories in international relations, the liberal peace is also oftentimes going to be seen as something that is universal in both its applicability, but also universal in its desirability. And we'll get into that in a brief moment. But the impacts then of the dominance of the liberal peace are twofold. So academically, it's resulted, unfortunately, in the marginalization of peace research within the field of IR. So peace research was originally conceived by Johann Galtung, and he envisioned the field as being a sort of counterbalance to the dominant field of conflict studies at that time, which oftentimes framed peace as being, once again, negative peace, so the absence of conflict. But Galtung characterized it slightly differently in his literature. And so he visualized peace as being made up of a positive and a negative strand. So the negative strand being, of course, the absence of direct physical or psychological harm, and the positive strand as being the absence of what he termed structural violence or indirect harm in the form of inequality, injustice, or discrimination. So Galtung visualized violence as being far broader than what we typically view it as. So violence to Galtung was anything that prevented human beings from attaining their full potential. Or so, for instance, if an individual lives in a condition of abject poverty, but that poverty is preventable in nature, then they're being subject to structural violence. Unfortunately, though, Galtung's conceptualization of peace was marginalized by many IR scholars who felt that it was overly subjective, far too broad, and referred to, quote, anything Galtung doesn't like. And so that's been one of the main effects of the dominance of this IR-centric liberal peace in terms of the academic realm. But if we look at it practically also, the the perceived universality of the liberal peace, in addition to just the sheer weight of resources that its proponents bring, has meant that the liberal peace has effectively managed to overshadow, outbid, and outgun any alternative visualizations. And in essence, this has created a very formulaic way of visualizing peace, what one peace scholar termed as being peace from IKEA, or a flat pack piece made from standardized components. And those standardized components include, for instance, a internationally sponsored peace mediation process, post-peace accord national elections, formalized demobilization, disarmament, and reintegration, and then the repatriation of displaced persons. And while this has certainly been while this formula has certainly been refined by the international community over the years, it comes at the cost of both marginalizing alternative visualizations of peace that don't fall in line with the values and the ideals of the liberal peace, with one UN employee actually being on record as saying that the UN cannot compromise on its values when dealing with the national actors. But at the same time, it also risks creating a very fragile peace, a peace that's more reflective of the capabilities of external actors than the actual needs of the local populace. And so one way that I think we can better come to understand the shortcomings of the liberal peace, but also some alternative ways of visualizing peace in both academic literature and practically, is through some case studies. So the first big case study I want to look at is Afghanistan. So I did quite a bit of literature on this, and Afghanistan is one of the shining examples of the shortcomings of liberal peace. So despite a 22-year international peace-building effort there, you still saw, for instance, the creation of a central government mired by corruption, the inability of the central government and international actors to provide economic opportunities, educational opportunities, and employment to rural communities, and ultimately the collapse of the central government of the Taliban in August of last year. And in many instances, the failure of liberal peace building in Afghanistan has been blamed on the illiberal nature of Afghan culture. Despite this, though, a survey conducted by Seongspo actually found that the overwhelming majority of Afghans surveyed were supportive of liberal peace-building efforts, but under two conditions: that liberal peace provided tangible benefits to the local populace, and that it respected local customs and traditions. Unfortunately, though, liberal peace-building in Afghanistan failed on both accounts. On the one hand, you had massive instances of waste and inefficiency, such as the creation of a $60 million power station that did not provide power to local communities, nor many employment prospects for locals, and simultaneously a very culturally abrasive counterinsurgency strategy centered on kill capture raids, operations in civilian areas that ultimately resulted in the alienation of the Afghan public. And so the ultimate irony of this, though, is that for many of the Afghans surveyed, the suggestions they had for improving peace in Afghanistan never revolved around abolishing this liberal peace-building effort so much as it did on refining it. So, for instance, two of the key suggestions were both increasing sensitivity and respect for local customs and traditions by international actors, and also improving coordination between internal and external organizations to ensure that aid was passed down to the Afghans. And so this entire notion then that liberal peace is somehow culturally incompatible with Afghanistan is a, quote, modernity-denying discourse that allowed the international community to, quote, make a grand exit with the convenience of blaming the Afghans. Another very interesting example that I researched was Northern Ireland. Once again, you see here the creation of an externally imposed peace on the country. So you had the Good Friday agreements that resulted, for instance, in reforms to the National Police Service, a power sharing agreement within within the national legislature. But despite this, you still see vast degrees of division at the community level. So that, for instance, is a Protestant community separated from neighboring Catholic homes by a steel wall. And so in essence, the situation is one where, quote, we live in peace, but we live apart. And so one way that we can visualize a way forward from this that's visible in both academic literature, but also practically on the ground, is through the concept of everyday peace, where routinized practices and interactions between individuals serve to bridge gaps in divided communities. And nowhere was this clear than in the literature I found on maternal interactions in integrated playgroups. So these integrated playgroups created an environment where Catholic and Protestant mothers were capable of interacting with one another with civility and with the common interests of their children in mind. And so this not only served to promote daily interactions that allowed both groups to play a more prominent role in one another's lives, with, for instance, a Catholic mother actually being invited to sit on the community center committee in a Protestant area of Belfast, but also created a situation where we see an increasingly prominent role played by two actors who were traditionally excluded from community level discussions on reconciliation, so namely women and children. And so I felt this was very interesting because it offers us a competing visualization of peace beyond that very rigid top-down institutional structure that we associate with the liberal peace. And it's backed up by both academic literature and also on-the-ground data collected by researchers. And the final example I wanted to draw your attention to was the case study of Somalia and Somaliland. So since the collapse of Siad Barre's government in 1991, Somalia has actually been subject to over 12 international peace-building efforts there. Despite this, though, they've all failed to establish a durable peace in the country. However, a notable contrast to this is the separatist province of Somaliland in northwestern Somalia, where you see a actually incredibly surprising degree of peace and harmony amidst the local communities, despite the ongoing conflict in the rest of the country. And this success of peace building in Somaliland stems from a practice known as hybrid peace, where bottom-up community practices complement a limited-scale national liberal peace building effort. And so, for instance, the government in Somaliland has the institutions we traditionally see in a liberal democracy favored by liberal peace builders, such as a democratically elected parliament and government, and also at the same time, community-based institutions like the House of the Elderly, the Gurti. And so while the national government does exercise some of the functions we typically associate with a centralized government, a lot of the functions that rely heavily on legitimacy are devolved to the local level. And that includes, for instance, elder-led mediation and community defense. And so what this does is it once again highlights the extent to which a sustainable and indeed legitimate peace is possible if we move past this very narrow conception of the liberal peace. And it also raises a number of implications as to ways forward in instances where we see the failure of international liberal peace building efforts. And so ultimately, I hope that this presentation has served to outline both some of the dominant discourses of peace and international relations, and also offered some alternative visualizations of peace backed by both academic literature, but also by some real-world case studies. And I think it's important for us to remember that ultimately the peace that's going to be created in many of these instances is not going to be in line with our expectations. It's going to be intractable, it's going to be illiberal, and in a number of instances, it's also going to be irreconcilable with our values. But simply because it differs from our idealized or romanticized notions of peace, such as, for instance, the concept of the liberal peace, does not diminish the effectiveness of these alternative visualizations and approaches. I think that the Brazilian diplomat Sérgio Vieira de Mello said it best when he said that a less than perfect solution that saved lives is better than an ideal solution never implemented. And I think that's both a very poignant and a very relevant quote when we consider the shortcomings of the liberal peace and also some of the alternative ways in which we can hopefully move forward to serve not necessarily as peacemakers, but as enablers to a sustainable and legitimate peace. So I hope you've enjoyed this presentation. This is my list of sources with access to the research portfolio that I created at the very bottom. And it's been a pleasure. And it's just been a pleasure sharing some of my findings with you. Thank you.